Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Grandmaster Knockout. In the left corner, the only Niemann, and his opponent, ladies and gentlemen, Vidit. Tonight, one board, 64 squares, playing white. Niemann playing black. Vidit. Gentlemen, let the battle begin. Niemann, pawn to f4. Vidit, pawn to e5. Niemann, knight to f3. Vidit, knight to c6. Niemann, bishop to b5. Vidit, knight to f6. Niemann, castles kingside. Vidit, knight takes a4. Niemann, pawn to d4. Vidit, knight to d6. Niemann, bishop takes c6. Vidit, pawn takes c6. Niemann, pawn takes a5. Vidit, knight to f5. Niemann, queen takes d8, check. Vidit, king takes d8. Niemann, pawn to h3. Vidit, king to e8. Niemann, knight to c3. Vidit, pawn to b6. Niemann, bishop to f4. Vidit, bishop to b4. Niemann, knight to e4. Vidit, bishop to e6. Niemann, pawn to c3. Vidit, bishop to e7. Niemann, pawn to g4. Vidit, knight to h4. Niemann, knight takes h4. Vidit, bishop takes h4. Niemann, bishop to g3. Vidit, bishop takes g3. Niemann, knight takes g3. Vidit, rook to d8. Niemann, rook to fd1. Vidit, king to e7. Niemann, pawn to f4. Vidit, pawn to a5. Niemann, pawn to b3. Vidit, pawn to g6. Niemann, king to f2. Vidit, rook takes d1. Niemann, rook takes d1. Vidit, pawn to h5. Niemann, pawn takes h5. Vidit, pawn takes h5. Niemann, pawn to h4. Vidit, bishop to g4. Niemann, rook to e1. Vidit, king to a6. Niemann, king to e3. Vidit, pawn to f6. Niemann, pawn to f5, check. Vidit, king takes a5. Niemann, king to f2, check. Vidit, king to d5. Niemann, rook to e7. Vidit, pawn to a4. Niemann, king to e3. Vidit, pawn takes b3. Niemann, pawn takes b3. Vidit, rook to a8. Niemann, rook to d7, check. Vidit, king to c5. Niemann, knight to e4, check. Vidit, king to b5. Niemann, rook takes c7. Vidit, rook to a3. Niemann, knight to d6, check. Vidit, king to c5. Niemann, knight to e4, check. Vidit, king to b5. Niemann, pawn to c4, check. Vidit, king to b4. Niemann, rook takes c6. Vidit, rook takes b3, check. Niemann, king to d4. Vidit, rook to f3. Niemann, rook takes b6, check. Vidit, king to a5. Niemann, rook takes f6. Vidit, bishop takes f5. Niemann, knight to d6. Vidit, rook to d3, check. Niemann, king to c5. Vidit, bishop to g4. Niemann, rook to f1. Vidit, king to a4. Niemann, knight to b5. Vidit, king to b3. Niemann, knight to d4, check. Vidit, king to b2. Niemann, rook to f2, check. Vidit, king to c1. Niemann, king to d5. Vidit, rook to h3. Niemann, pawn to c5. Vidit, rook takes h4. Niemann, pawn to c6. Vidit, rook to h3. Niemann, pawn to c7. Vidit, rook to c3. Niemann, knight to b5. Vidit, rook to c2. Niemann, rook to f1, check. Vidit, king to b2. Niemann, king to d6. Vidit, rook to d2, check. Niemann, king to c5. Vidit, rook to c2, check. Niemann, king to b6. Vidit, pawn to h4. Niemann, rook to f4. Vidit, bishop to d7. Niemann, rook takes h4. Vidit, rook to c6, check. Niemann, king to b7. Vidit, rook to c5. Niemann, knight to d6. Vidit, king to b3. Niemann, rook to h7. Vidit, bishop to g4. Niemann, rook to g7. Vidit, bishop to e6. Niemann, king to b6. Vidit, rook to c1. Niemann, knight to b5. Vidit, bishop to c8. Niemann, rook to g8. Vidit, bishop to d7. Niemann, rook to g7. Vidit, bishop to c8. Niemann, knight to d6. Vidit, bishop to e6. Niemann, rook to e7. Vidit, bishop to g4. Niemann, rook to e5. Vidit, king to a4. Niemann, rook to e4, check. Niemann lands the knockout. Vidit has no answer. If you loved this fight, smash that like button and subscribe. More legendary battles are coming your way. See you in the next one.